Welcome, Irish fans, to another edition of the Irish Breakdown podcast. I am Vince DeDario, the football analyst here at irishbreakdown.com. And with me, as always, is my partner, Bryan Driskell. He is the publisher at irishbreakdown.com. Bryan, good weekend this weekend. We got to watch the little Super Bowl. That's always a good thing, depending on, I guess, who you were rooting for. But it was a fun weekend. It was a good weekend. For those of you that follow us on a regular basis, I'm back. I appreciate it. I was a little under the weather the past few days, so Bryan did me the solid and picked up the slack for me, so I appreciate that. But I'm back, and maybe some of you are unhappy about that, but here I am.
No one's unhappy about that, because every time I do a show by myself, I get text messages or DMs like, hey, is Vince gone? What's going on, Vince? So you are the glue that holds this thing together.
Yeah.
And so when you're not on, that's why I had to tell people that you were sick, because I didn't want people to think that something was wrong. But yeah, I'm glad you're feeling better. And I still think it was just a coincidence that you just got sick on Super Bowl weekend. You know, I'm sick. Yeah.
Handy that way. Very handy. I'll be sick again right around the first weekend of March Madness.
Sure.
So just give you the heads up on that.
Yep.
But anyway, we have a commitment that we want to talk about. And this is a big one for Notre Dame from everything that I can gather. But it's a defensive end commitment. His name is Aiden Gobera. He's from Chantilly, Virginia. He's the class of 22. So we're talking next year's class, but it's the current class now that everything is signed, sealed, delivered with the 21 class, which is just weird to say. So Notre Dame's going strong here on the 22 class. I want to ask you, what's the background on this particular commitment? Is this somebody that's been on Notre Dame's radar for a long time? Is this solely a Marcus Freeman situation? Give us the background, kind of how this came to be.
This is a guy that Mike Elson's been recruiting for a while.
Okay.
This is the kind of kid that fits everything that Mike Elson looks for in a defensive end. And we'll get into that here in a little bit when we kind of get into his specifics of him as a player. But no, it's a lot like the Tyson Ford thing, to be honest with you.
Okay.
Mike Elson's been putting in yeoman's work on it, but he's been kind of running solo. And when you're going against programs like Penn State, and Penn State had been the perceived leader with Aiden Gobera for a long time, Penn State doesn't solo recruit top prospects, and they considered Aiden the top prospect, just like Notre Dame did. And when it's you versus you as the D-line coach against the D-line coach at Penn State, the defensive coordinator at Penn State, the head coach at Penn State, and, a big chunk of the staff, it's going to be tough. So I think Marcus Freeman coming in is a lot like Tyson Ford. He helped kind of Mike Elson get it over the top. But the reason that they were able to get Tyson Ford in the class so early, the reason they were able to get Aiden Gobera so quickly, I mean, we're now a month in. It was a month ago today that Marcus Freeman got hired as the defensive coordinator. It was January 8th is when it was announced.
Wow.
And so, I mean, it was because the work that Mike Elson had previously put in. So it's kind of like Mike Elson was able to get him a long way, and then once you kind of get that supporting cast coming in to help out, then they put him over the finish line. And so it was a big pickup. And look, this is a guy that as of 2 weeks ago, if you'd asked me where I thought he was going to go, I'd have told you probably Penn State, but Notre Dame is trying. And he was a guy, when I talked to some sources a couple weeks ago, I started putting some defensive line content out about who's on the board. This is a guy that I looked at. He actually has one of the lower grades that I have for the DNs on the board for sort of the top guys for who he is now.
Okay.
Because he didn't play as a junior. Virginia postponed their fall football season, and they're going to try and play in the spring. We'll see if that happens or not. But he didn't play as a junior. So the last time we saw him play, he was like a 6'5", 6'6", skinny kid that was barely over 200 pounds. But you could see the skills you liked, but I think that's kind of why he's not considered that higher level recruit. But to Notre Dame, to Penn State, to some of the other schools that have offered like Nebraska, Kentucky, Louisville, Virginia Tech, BC Pitt, this is a high ceiling player that they really wanted. And so Notre Dame is in a unique situation with this too, Vince, because there's a lot of really talented defensive ends on the board. They can be picky.
Yeah.
So the fact that they pushed for him, not just took a commitment from him, but pushed for him, to the point where they were able to overcome the perceived leader, Penn State, who does very well in the state of Virginia, by the way. Have for a long time, even going back to when I was in high school, I played against James Boyd at Indian River High School back in the day, and he's the guy that went to Penn State. They got Chris Bell from Granby from my area back in the day. So they've always done really well in the state of Virginia. And when, the running back, they've signed, how many running backs have they signed from Virginia lately? So anyway, they're hard to beat for kids in state, as far as one of the national programs. So this was a big one for Notre Dame and a guy that they really wanted. And even though he had one of the lower grades for the current grade, his upside grade was as high as just about anybody on the board. So this was an important one. This wasn't just some, and you'll see by the time his recruitment is over, you'll see this isn't just some 3-star kid.
That was going to be my next question. Is he a kid that, in your opinion, could blow up his senior year as far as the recruiting rankings and all? I mean, I realize he's committed, and once you're committed to Notre Dame, I realize sometimes there's not a lot of fluctuation this way, but more the other way. But I mean, is this somebody that you could see, his recruitment just kind of skyrocket a little bit with his senior year as he grows into his body a little more?
Certainly possible. He's supposedly up to 230 pounds now. You'll see it from this film. He's skinny. But what you're going to see in this film is a long kid. You just watch that push pull release there on that clip right there. If you're watching, if you're on podcast, just check it out. It'll be on irishbreakdown.com. You'll be able to see the video clips. But he's a very skinny kid, and it's all going to be about how he fills out his frame. And if he fills out his frame the way I think he can, he plays against really good competition in Virginia. So when I was in high school, it was Tidewaters where the best players were at. And Richmond had good players. You'd have a team or two in Northern Virginia. But in the last 10, 15 years, Northern Virginia football has gotten a lot better as that population has really boomed. And so when he's putting up numbers against some very, very good programs, and he's playing against some very, very good programs. So, yeah, I do believe, Vince, he's the kind of kid that if he has the kind of physical growth that I think he's going to have,
sure,
as a junior, senior, yeah, I think his reputation is going to go up. I think some bigger programs like Notre Dame are going to try to coerce him into considering them, which we've seen from a lot of Notre Dame commits. But this is a very talented kid. This is a kid that, in my opinion, if he would have had his junior year, would have had a chance to be a top 250 caliber prospect, assuming he's made the physical growth that we've heard that he's made. So, we'll see. We'll kind of see if that happens. But yeah, this is a commitment that I really like, and it really fits the profile of what Notre Dame looks for. I mean, length, right? You saw that in the clips.
Burst. I mean,
burst off the
edge.
line. Yeah, burst off the line. Strong. I mean, when you consider he's barely 200 pounds, he's throwing guys around. I mean, there's his push pull release is really impressive, and that you need length to do that, but you also need some natural strength, and I think that's what Notre Dame saw. I think the question for me, Vince, is he's an instinctive player. He's good against the run. There's a really nice play where he sets the edge and then spins inside to get to the ball carrier. That's instinct. That's just having a feel for it. But then you have to have the athleticism. There's things I instinctively wanted to do on the football field but couldn't do because I didn't have the physical tools of top quarterbacks. So,
I don't know what you're talking about. I've never had that problem ever.
So, he has the instincts, but also the athletic skill to pull it off. And so he's an impressive kid on film.
Yeah.
I think the question for me at this point, Vince, is, how does he fill out his frame? And how he fills out his frame is going to determine ultimately, is he more of a big end? Mm-hmm. Is he more of a viper end? Is he more of a combo guy? I think that part of it remains to be seen, and we're not going to really know that till he's done with his final year and a half of high school football.
Well, and I think a year in the strength program at Notre Dame is going to make a big difference for him too, and how well he can put weight on that frame of his. So that was going to be my next question: is how you see him fitting in to the Notre Dame defense. And I realize there are still some question marks about what the Notre Dame defense is going to look like under Marcus Freeman. But again, we're projecting as to what we think things are going to look like under this program. So, or under this scheme, I should say. Where do you see Aiden fitting in?
I think ultimately I like his game better as the big end. Okay. I think he's more of a, Mike Elson broke down the difference in the defensive linemen, right? And one thing he talked about with it's going to look similar to what it's been in the past. The big end is a pure defensive end. It's a power end. It's a guy that's got to be able to set the edge and rush the passer and be good against the run. The drop end is going to be more of a versatile player. The ideal drop end for them, based on what Mike Elson said, is a guy like Dalen Hayes, a guy that can drop into coverage 10, 15 times a game at least, a guy that can rush the passer, a guy that can play the edge. Aiden to me is not a guy that I necessarily would see dropping in coverage other than maybe just kind of jumping into the flats. That's not ideally what they want to do. They want to have a guy that can run with tight ends and run with backs, which we've seen Dalen Hayes do. And so I think his game better suits the big end position. Having said that, with his athleticism, if he continues to I think there's at times there's some awkwardness to him. And what I mean by that is awkwardness in a way of what you see from time to time from a kid who grew tall before he grew out. Yeah, and you see some at times that lankiness, that growth spurt can kind of cause you to, your coordination at times would be a little inconsistent. And just there's just a couple times as you watch this film where you just kind of see that. Well, the good news about that is that eventually goes away as guys get used to being taller and they fill out their frames. And so, there's a level of athleticism there where, potentially maybe he could be a guy that drops. But I think right now with what we see from him, to me, he's a guy that I view more as, more as a guy that I think is going to be more of a rush the passer, play the run, be physical, that kind of guy. And so I think the big end spot is ultimately where he plays. But the fact that we're having this conversation and asking the question is also adds to his versatility, because there is a level of, okay, this guy can play the other end spot. When you're in a 3-down, both of your ends are going to be a little bit more traditional ends. So there's that versatility that he brings. And if he really fills out his frame and he, who knows? I mean, again, we need to see it. I don't project this, but I also didn't think Jason Onye would be 275 by the time he gets to Notre Dame. So he filled out his frame faster. Now, Jason Onye was thicker than Aiden Gobera is at this same age. But the point is, if he fills his frame out even more than I think he can, then there's even more versatility that he could be that penetrating 3 technique in passing situations or against passing teams, not running teams, right? You understand it. And those are the things that you're going to need to look more for in this defense, because I do think, we had the Insider podcast out earlier today where I talked about some of the things I'm hearing about Marcus Freeman. And look, I believe based on what I'm hearing, their quote unquote base defense is going to be a 4-down defense, but they're not going to be as reliant on that as the past 4 defensive coordinators were, where they were always going to be sort of in the same personnel, whether they were in, on first and second down, kind of no matter who they played. And occasionally Notre Dame would put a nickel on the field against certain teams, more so like in 2017 and 2018 than recently, but they're not going to be that locked into that base defense. There's going to be weeks where we see more 3-down. There's going to be weeks where we see more 4-down. And when you have that kind of scheme versatility, it doesn't work as well if you don't have scheme versatile players. Yeah. And I think that's what I really like about Aiden Gobera is he's a guy that I think could grow into a power end, but he also is a guy that could maybe do some drop stuff. And the other thing too is if you're the rotation drop, not the starting drop, then you're even less inclined to have to do all the different drop things with him. If he's a guy you just look at it as an athletic edge rusher, then, Marcus Freeman's going to say, okay, look, this is our second best end. We have, Tyson Ford starting at strong side end, for example. Let's say that Aiden Gobera is the number 2 defensive end. They're not going to keep him on the sideline. They're going to find a role for him on the other side of the line. And, and then of course, when you're in your 3-down, that both ends are now more true ends. And so there's that flexibility there. So I think they need to try to find as many position flexible players as you can get. And that's everywhere except really nose tackle. I mean, if you think about it, they're going to need that across the board. Tyson Ford brings some of that. He's the guy that he's already 250. He's a guy that maybe can be that when you go to more of a penetrating 4-down against a pass heavy team. Maybe you slide him inside a little bit. Yeah. Put him in some 3 technique. And when I talk about Tyson Ford, a 3 technique, I'm not talking about lining up on 1st and 10 against Stanford right, with him at 3 technique, or against Alabama with him at 3 technique. I'm talking about when you're playing a team like a USC, a North Carolina, maybe you're playing an AAC team that wants to throw the ball a lot, and they're not really a team that runs a true air raid, the old school air raid, not the modern air raids like Lincoln Riley runs that I like a lot, which are going to run the football. Phil Longo at UNC runs a more modern air raid, but they're still like Graham Harrell at USC runs an old school air raid where there's games where USC will run the ball 12 times. Well, if you're going to go to a 4-down look, you don't necessarily need 2 300-pounders inside against that look. Right. So maybe you see a guy like Tyson Ford. Now you have some 4-down versatility that you wouldn't otherwise have if your ends were just pure ends and didn't have that versatility. So that's kind of what I refer to. And that's kind of the thing we have to condition ourselves to look for when we evaluate Notre Dame prospects is, does this guy bring some positional flexibility and some positional versatility? And for me, Aiden Gobera brings that. I think he's a guy that can do more than just a pure big end, a pure viper. I think he brings some versatility. How much and where that versatility is going to be is going to depend on, as we talked about, how much he fills out his frame.
So from a class breakdown, you said they've got a lot of guys on their board, but now they can be more, they can be more picky about who they want to go with defensive end wise. Do you see how many more do you see, committing, and do you see that in the very near future?
So when I look at the roster right now, Vince, I see a situation where Notre Dame right now, as I look at their depth chart, has 9 defensive ends returning next season. Okay. One of them is Myron Tungavaloa-Mosa, who is a 5th-year senior. Now, technically, he could come back in 2022 because everybody has an extra year. Justin Adamiola could come back for a 5th year in 2022. But really, there's 7 ends on the roster that are gonna have some eligibility beyond the 2021 season for certain. So I think at least 3 is ideal, the ideal number here at defensive end. I think a 3rd guy is needed. They could take a 4th if like some 5-star decides he wants to come down the road, then you make room for that guy. But I think a 3rd end is needed, and I think at this point in time, I think a more of a drop viper type of guy is what is needed in the class. Okay. So I think that's where they are from a number standpoint. This is going to be a smaller class. I'm going to have some stuff. We're going to talk this week on the podcast about breaking down the needs of the 2022 class. We'll get into numbers but this is not going to be a 27-man class like it was in 2021. So, but this is a position where I do think needs are important, or numbers are important, because when you look at the roster, I mean, you've had some turnover. You lost Ovia Gofu. You've had, some guys that have moved around. Your numbers aren't great. So there's been some injuries. So like Nana Osafa-Mensah, we don't know what his future holds because of injuries. So there's some uncertainty there from a number standpoint. Love the talent, but the numbers. And so I think that's why another 3-man class. They had a 3-man class in 2021. But again, low floor, high ceiling guys, you don't want to just assume they're going to pan out. Same thing with Alexander Ahrensberger in the 2020 class. So there's some high ceiling players that have come on at defensive end in the last 2 classes, but they're also lower floor guys. Sure. And you have to make sure that you load up on numbers, and then that increases the odds that you're going to get enough guys to tap into their full potential, that you're going to have a great defensive line, which is what I believe Notre Dame has had in recent seasons. So I think a 3rd guy is needed, but I think that 3rd guy has to be more of an established talent. Okay. That doesn't mean he has to be like a guy that's going to step on the field day one, but he's got to be a very talented, high upside player, and I certainly have a guy in mind for that position.
Oh, do you now?
I do.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So stay tuned, people, because Brian's got somebody in mind.
We can talk about it right now. That was kind of my little segue.
Oh, okay. Why didn't you look like you were keeping it under
I wasn't teasing them like I'm going to tune in tomorrow. I'm not going to be that guy.
I felt teased. Okay. Yes. So go ahead. Who do you think is going to be the guy?
Well, it's not who I think is going to be the guy. It's I think who needs to be the guy. Oh, and I think that who needs to be the guy is Cyrus Moss. Okay. He is a 5-star defensive end from Nevada. Some have him as a 5-star. He's another guy that didn't get to play as a junior because of the state not having football in the fall. But to me, he is that true 5-star upside elite viper type of player that Notre Dame wants and needs. He's an explosive athlete. He reminds me more sort of a Julian Okwara with Dalen Hayes cover ability. That's kind of how I'd evaluate him. He's not built like Dalen. He's not, 260. He's not going to be like a thick, lower bodied 265 like Dalen Hayes. His body's built more like Julian, although I think he's got a little bit better frame than Julian Okwara. But he's going to be a 245 to 255 pound guy, athletic, explosive burst off the edge. You watch him in coverage and he's dropping underneath routes. He's, there's a pick six he had in high school. And again, he plays at Bishop Gorman out in Las Vegas. So they're playing national programs. That's just kind of what they've always done. And he's dropping under curl routes and picking them off and returning them for touchdowns. He's raw technically, and his body needs time to develop, but he's a guy that to me has a chance to be an impact edge rusher in college. And I don't just mean like, a guy that can give you 4 or 5 sacks. I'm talking about a guy that can be like a dynamic Josh Allen from Kentucky type of edge rusher. Now, you never know how kids are going to pan out, but when I see Cyrus Moss, I'm thinking, wow, that's the kind of athlete that Notre Dame needs more of along the defensive line. And I think he brings a little bit of a different, body type than the 2 guys that they have in the class. And so I love the complementary nature of what he would be to Tyson Ford and Aiden Gobera. He's 6'4", 220 right now. But he doesn't have that big frame like Aiden Gobera has, where like eventually he's going to be 270 potentially. He's more of a traditional athletic edge viper. And so Cyrus Moss, to me, at this point in time, and my understanding talking to different sources, is he has been at the sort of the top of their board for that position for a while. My thought would be is that this commitment gets Notre Dame to now focus even more time on him. And so let's kind of talk about Brian Kelly for a second. And they talk about like how a head coach needs to be. This is the situation now where you've been able to narrow your board. You've already got a couple guys committed. This is where the head coach needs to step in as well and say, that kid needs to be a priority of yours until we get him. Right. And so it needs to be Marcus Freeman. It needs to be Mike Ellison. It needs to be Brian Kelly. It needs to be Brian Poling. Like, they need to put the full court press on that kid. He likes Notre Dame. They're in a good place. So
stand with him, and who else is involved?
Yeah. I mean, everyone.
So what you're telling me is it's not like, I shouldn't say what you're telling me. It's not like he goes to a school that nobody knows about. He goes to Bishop Gorman.
He's not an under-the-radar kid. Right. He's not some under-the-radar kid that you can just sneak past people. With, like a Jason Onye that we've seen. I mean, you're going to have to beat Alabama, USC, programs like that. That's who's on Cyrus Moss. Now, I do think he's a kid that has interest in an academic institution. He's you listen to him interview as a sophomore, and you're like, we've had a couple interviews with him at Irish Breakdown in the past, and you're like, this is a pretty savvy sophomore in high school. You know what I mean? Like, this is not a kid that you expect to be like a 15, 16. I mean, he's got some maturity to him. He's got some focus to him. He's got some big picture to his thought process, thinking beyond just, I'm going to go somewhere where I can have 15 sacks and win a championship. He wants those things, but he also has a deeper understanding. And guys like that tend to gravitate and like Notre Dame. And so the point is, maybe you can't get half the, you can't recruit half the guys in the top 100, but there are always guys like this that are Notre Dame fits. This is the kind of kid you need to put the absolute full court press on and make sure you get. There are some other kids in the class that I like. There's some hybrid players like Arliss Boardingham from California, who's kind of a high school receiver. Elijah Brown from Ohio, who is a tight end, a really good tight end. There's some intriguing players like that, DJ Wezolak. So, then you could say, maybe instead of taking a second defensive tackle in the class, they need to get a first. But, maybe instead of taking 2 defensive tackles, which I think is a need, maybe they take a 4th defensive end like an Isaac Ham, who's a 6'5", 260-pound defensive tackle that they want to turn into sort of like a Riley Mills 3 technique. So there's some flexibility with a lot of the players on the board. And Mike Ellison has really done a great job so far of having a big board of talented players. What I'm curious to see is, does this eliminate, this should, but do they eliminate certain players? For example, Alex Bauman, who is the younger brother of Kevin Bauman. I don't know if he's a take now for me. I don't know, unless you're going to take 4 defensive ends. I'm not sure if you want to take him at this point in time. Do you want to take him and then say, well, we can't take Cyrus Moss? So I'm curious to see how they handle that. Or do they say, yeah, we'll take a kid like that, but because he can also play tight end, That's the other thing is Alex Bauman also plays tight end like his brother. Elijah Brown, Arliss Boardingham, the reason I mention them is they're also offensive players. So, maybe you bring them in now, and if depending on how your board fills out, so not that those guys would commit to Notre Dame now, but I'm just making the point that I think there's some flexibility there. But the fact is they have to make sure that there's room to bring in a guy like Cyrus Moss, and they have to put the full court press on him as a staff. And it's almost like you say to Mike Ellison, like there's literally no one more important right now on your board than him. And everyone needs to be involved. Chris O'Leary, Tommy Reese, Jeff. Everybody should be talking to Cyrus Moss in some way, shape, form, or fashion to make him to do what you got to do. Because this is a Notre Dame kid, but they don't get every Notre Dame kid. That's the problem. And this is one that they need to close on. If they can add Cyrus Moss to a defensive end class that already has Tyson Ford and Aiden Gobera, we haven't seen a defensive end class like that at Notre Dame since 2016. And we all know how the 2016 class panned out because it's now going to have 4 ends from that class are going to end up playing pro football. If you think about think about that. Dalen Hayes and Adetokunbo Ogundeji are about to get drafted. And Khalid Kareem and Julian Aguara were 5th and 3rd round picks respectively last season. So to be able to produce 4 NFL players from one defensive draft class is impressive. And you add Cyrus Moss to this class, I think that's a similar type of – those are 3 kids that have potential to be professional football players down the road and impact college players. You have to get it done. And that's why I say Cyrus Moss is a must, absolute must get for Notre Dame at this point.
Okay. Well, good stuff on the most recent Notre Dame commit, defensive end Aiden Gobera from Virginia. And we know that there is an affinity for Virginia players at Irish Breakdown.
That's just where the real ballers are from, Vince. I keep trying to tell you this. That's just the reality of it.
I'm converted. You don't have to convince me. I'm just pointing it out to all of our listeners that we appreciate players from Virginia. That's all. So that's Aiden Gobera. And hopefully Notre Dame is got the full court press on Cyrus Moss.
I think this is ultimately, Vince, a plot by Brian Kelly to try to get me get on my good side. I think it's like, hey, Driskell's been hammering me this offseason. We got to get some more Virginia guys.
Whatever it takes.
Yeah, so he get him off my back for a little bit. But yeah, this is a big one. This is a big pickup for Notre Dame.
It was a huge pickup for Notre Dame. But stay tuned because we've got another good one coming for you tomorrow. Brian and I are going to talk a little offense, a little Tommy Reese offense. So stay tuned for that. That'll be going up tomorrow. So wherever you get your podcast, make sure you subscribe so you get that automatic download. We are dangerously close on our YouTube channel to that 1,000 subscribers. So, punch that subscribe button. That way you're notified when we upload some videos. We've had some good ones. Brian has been ridiculously busy this weekend.
Snowed in. What else am I going to do?
Facts. While I was on my deathbed, he was actually doing work. No, I had a head cold. It is what it is. But he was doing work. He was putting out videos, and there is a lot of content there. So make sure you check it out. Make sure you subscribe to that. And then, of course, make sure you check out irishbreakdown.com because the articles are fast and furious.
And free.
Free.
Right now, all of our content at Irish Breakdown is free. So you do not have to be a subscriber. There's no sign up necessary to read articles. Just again, we're trying to bring you content on as many outlets and forums as possible. So we appreciate your patronage, but help us get to that 1,000. So if you have not subscribed, smash that subscribe button over there would be on your right, your bottom right. You'll see that little IB square. Vince is pointing at it. Give us a subscription. And also what we want to have more from you is more comments. Let us know what you think. Engage with us. I had a guy, shout out to Justin Case the other day. He and I were debating. We were disagreeing, but it was an awesome debate. He was coming with facts. He was coming with arguments. I didn't necessarily agree with them, but they were well supported. We love that kind of stuff. We want to engage with you in that kind of stuff. And if you have ideas for shows that you'd like us to do, we have written down a couple of suggestions that people have given. Somebody brought up, wanting to jump ahead to the 2022 class. We're going to have several videos and breakdowns on our podcast this week talking about the needs for the 2022 class. We're going to do couple must-get videos and podcasts about the players that are going to be really the difference between Notre Dame having a good top 8 to 13 type of class like they've always had, and Notre Dame sort of having that top 5 to 7 caliber class, which is what we think is the next step needed to finally get over that hump. And so we're going to talk about all that. So we took that suggestion. We're going to run with it. So if you have some things you'd like to hear about, let us know in the comment section, but only after you've hit subscribe.
Very important. So for Bryan Driskell, he's the publisher. I'm Vince DeDario. I'm the football analyst. We will talk to you next time on the Irish Breakdown Podcast.